November 2, 1944. Thorpe Abbotts Airfield, England. 5:47 a.m. The briefing room at the 100th Bomb Group smelled of stale cigarette smoke and nervous sweat. 200 men sat on wooden benches facing a wall-sized map of Germany, their breath visible in the unheated Quonset hut. Lieutenant Robert Holloway, pilot of B-17 number 42 to 31673, which his crew had christened Lucky 13, studied the red ribbon stretching across the map from England deep into the German industrial heartland. The target was Merseburg, home to the Leuna synthetic oil refinery. Major operations officer pulled back the curtain revealing the route, and a collective groan rippled through the assembled crews. Merseburg again. 3 previous raids on this target had cost the 8th Air Force 140 bombers and 1,400 men. The flak was murderous. The fighter defenses were thick. And intelligence suggested the Germans had moved additional anti-aircraft batteries into the area after the last raid 2 weeks ago. Holloway was 23 years old, though the deep lines around his eyes made him look older. This would be his 19th mission, 6 away from completing his tour and going home to Milwaukee. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Chen, sat beside him making notes in a small leather journal he'd carried on every mission. Chen was 22, the son of Chinese immigrants, one of fewer than 200 Asian American pilots flying in the European theater. The intelligence officer continued. Weather would be clear over the target, which meant good bombing accuracy but also perfect visibility for German fighters and flak gunners. Fighter escort would accompany them to the target but would have to turn back before the bombing run due to fuel limitations. The final minutes over the target, the most dangerous, they would be on their own. In the back of the briefing room, Technical Sergeant William Foster, Holloway's flight engineer and top turret gunner, listened with the fatalism of a man who'd seen too many empty bunks. Foster was 28, older than most of the crew, a former automobile mechanic from Detroit who understood machines better than he understood people. He'd flown 16 missions with Holloway's crew and had developed a sixth sense for mechanical problems. This morning that sense was tingling. The briefing ended with the standard reminder: maintain formation discipline, keep radio silence except for emergencies, and if forced to bail out over Germany, destroy all documents before capture. Holloway's crew filed out into the pre-dawn darkness where ground crews were already loading bombs into the B-17s lined up along the flight line. Lucky 13 sat in her revetment, for massive propellers motionless in the cold November air. The Fortress was a veteran herself, having flown 67 missions with various crews. Her aluminum skin bore patches over flak holes, and her paint was worn thin from countless hours at high altitude. But she'd always brought her crews home, which was why Holloway's crew trusted her despite her age and scars. As dawn broke gray and cold over the English countryside, Holloway completed his pre-flight inspection with Chen. The B-17 held 2,700 gallons of fuel, 6,000 pounds of bombs, and 10 men whose lives depended on these 4 engines continuing to run for the next 8 hours. Every gauge, every control, every instrument had to be perfect. This far into enemy territory, a single mechanical failure could mean death for all of them. At 7:15 a.m., Foster noticed something during his final check of the flight engineer's panel. The standby magnetic compass, mounted on the bulkhead behind the pilot's seats, was behaving strangely. The compass card seemed to drift slowly even though the aircraft was stationary. He tapped the glass with his knuckle. The card wobbled, then settled, then began drifting again. Foster called Holloway over. They watched the compass together. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but definitely wrong. A magnetic compass should hold steady when the aircraft isn't moving. This one was hunting, searching, as if uncertain where magnetic north actually was. Holloway pulled out his pocket compass and held it up for comparison. His pocket compass pointed steady and true. The aircraft compass continued its slow, uncertain drift. There wasn't time to change aircraft. 36 B-17s were scheduled for this mission, and every available bomber was needed. The primary compass, the more sophisticated directional gyro mounted on the pilot's instrument panel, appeared to be working normally. The malfunctioning magnetic compass was technically a backup system, used only if the primary compass failed or needed to be reset. Holloway made a decision. They would fly the mission using the directional gyro as primary navigation, with Chen's pocket compass as emergency backup. The magnetic compass would be ignored. It was a reasonable call given the circumstances. Thousands of bombers had flown combat missions with minor instrument problems. The mission would be conducted in formation anyway, following the lead navigator's directions. Individual aircraft compasses were less critical when flying in tight formation. At 7:42 a.m., 36 B-17s from the 100th Bomb Group lifted off into the overcast English sky. Lucky 13 settled into her position in the high squadron, flying as number 3 in the second element. The formation climbed slowly, circling the assembly point while other bomb groups formed up around them. By 8:30 a.m., over 400 bombers were droning eastward across the North Sea toward Europe. The formation was beautiful and terrible to witness from the ground. Mile after mile of heavy bombers in precise geometric patterns, their contrails sketching white lines across the gray November sky. Each bomber carried 10 men and 3 tons of explosives. Each bomber represented over $250,000 of American industrial might. And each bomber was heading toward a place where men had designed ingenious methods of knocking them from the sky. They crossed the Dutch coast at 24,000 feet, and the flak began immediately. Black puffs of smoke materialized around the formation as German 88mm guns opened fire. The explosions were soundless from inside the bomber, but you could feel them when they hit close, a sharp concussion that rattled the aircraft and reminded you that you were in a thin aluminum tube surrounded by high explosive and aviation fuel. Holloway's crew had developed their routines over 18 previous missions. Foster manned the top turret, scanning for fighters. Staff Sergeant Raymond Tucker and Sergeant Miguel Santos handled the waist guns. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien lay in the ball turret beneath the aircraft, the loneliest position on the bomber. Technical Sergeant David Goldstein, the radio operator, monitored frequencies for recall orders or emergency signals. Staff Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, the tail gunner, watched their 6 o'clock for fighters attacking from behind. In the nose, Bombardier Lieutenant Marcus Stevens and Navigator Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell worked at their stations. Mitchell's navigation table was covered with maps and plotting tools. Every few minutes he would calculate their position based on visual landmarks when possible, or dead reckoning when clouds obscured the ground below. Stevens prepared his bomb sight for the run over the target still 2 hours away. At 10:15 a.m. the fighter escort turned back as briefed. The P-51 Mustangs that had shepherded them across Germany waggled their wings and peeled away, fuel tanks nearly empty. The bomber stream continued alone into the heartland of the Third Reich. This was the most dangerous phase, the period when German fighters could attack without fear of American escorts. The first fighters appeared at 10:27 a.m. Focke-Wulf 190s diving through the formation, their cannons flashing. The defensive fire from 400 bombers created a wall of tracers and steel, but the German pilots were skilled and determined. 2 bombers in the lead group took direct hits and fell away from the formation, one breaking apart immediately, the other spiraling down trailing fire. Inside Lucky 13, Foster called out fighter positions from his top turret. 3 o'clock high. 9 o'clock level. 12 o'clock coming in fast. The waist gunners opened fire, their 50 caliber machine guns hammering away. Spent brass casings bounced across the floor. The acrid smell of gun smoke filled the aircraft. At 10:51 a.m. something happened that changed everything. The lead navigator's B-17, the aircraft that the entire 100th Bomb Group was following, took a direct hit from flak. The explosion tore away part of the nose, killing the navigator instantly. The lead bomber began losing altitude, unable to maintain formation. The deputy lead, flying in the slot position, moved forward to take over. But in the confusion of the moment, the deputy lead's navigator made an error. He adjusted course based on his dead reckoning position, which was off by several degrees due to stronger headwinds than forecast. The course correction was small, only about 8 degrees, but at 200 miles per hour, 8 degrees of error compounds quickly. The entire 100th Bomb Group followed the deputy lead onto the new heading. Except Lucky 13. Holloway and Chen were flying on instruments, relying primarily on their directional gyro to maintain heading. But the gyro, like all gyroscopic instruments, tends to drift over time and needs to be periodically reset against the magnetic compass. Standard procedure was to check the gyro against the compass every 15 to 20 minutes and correct any drift. At 11:02 a.m., Chen noticed that their directional gyro showed them flying about 10 degrees off from the formation's heading. This was unusual, more drift than normal. Following standard procedure, he reached for the magnetic compass to reset the gyro. The compass was still drifting, still hunting uncertainly. Chen showed it to Holloway. They had a decision to make. Trust the malfunctioning magnetic compass and adjust their heading to match what it was showing, or ignore the compass and maintain their current heading to stay in formation. The formation was paramount. A straggler was a dead bomber. Every briefing, every mission, every survival lesson learned in blood emphasized one rule above all: stay in formation. But Holloway and Chen couldn't see the formation leader clearly through the clouds that had moved in. They were flying on instruments, trying to maintain position relative to other aircraft they could barely see. Were they drifting off course or was the formation drifting? Chen made a split-second decision. He used his pocket compass, the one that had agreed with his instrument checks back in England, to verify their heading. The pocket compass agreed with their directional gyro. They were on the correct heading to Merseburg. It was the formation that had drifted off course. Holloway keyed the radio to inform the formation leader, but remembered the strict radio silence order. Breaking radio silence could alert German fighters and flak batteries to the bomber stream's position. He made his own split-second decision. He would maintain his current heading, the one that should take them to Merseburg, and hope the formation would correct itself. For the next 7 minutes, Lucky 13 gradually separated from the 100th Bomb Group. The gap widened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Holloway and Chen kept hoping the formation would turn back toward them. Instead, the formation continued on its altered course, pulling further away with each passing minute. By 11:09 a.m. they faced a stark reality. They could chase the formation, abandoning their heading and trying to catch up, which would leave them vulnerable as a lone straggler. Or they could continue on what they believed was the correct course to Merseburg, flying alone but on the right heading for the target. Holloway made the hardest decision of his life. He continued on course toward Merseburg alone. A single B-17 over Germany was a death sentence. Everyone knew it. A lone bomber was meat for fighter pilots, an easy kill that would barely count as a victory. Foster, from his top turret, watched the rest of the 100th Bomb Group disappear into the clouds to the north. He reported to Holloway on the intercom, "We're alone, Lieutenant." The next 23 minutes were the longest of their lives. Every man in Lucky 13 knew what being alone meant. They scanned the sky for fighters with desperate intensity. Tucker and Santos in the waist positions pressed their faces against their gun sights, searching every cloud, every shadow. O'Brien in the ball turret hung beneath the aircraft in his plexiglass sphere, with nothing between him and 24,000 feet of empty air except optical glass and his faith in American engineering. The crew was silent except for position reports. Even the normal banter that helped pass the time on milk runs fell away. They were a lone target in hostile skies, waiting for the inevitable attack that would come from some direction they weren't watching, from some angle they hadn't covered. At 11:27 a.m., they reached what should have been the initial point, the navigation checkpoint where bombers would turn onto the final bombing run. Mitchell, the navigator, double-checked his calculations. According to his dead reckoning, they were within 2 miles of where they should be. But where was Merseburg? Where was the massive oil refinery that should be visible from this altitude? They flew on, straining to see through gaps in the clouds. At 11:31 a.m., they broke through into clear air, and Mitchell saw a landscape he recognized. Railroad junction, distinctive river bend, small town with a Gothic church spire. His maps confirmed it. They were exactly where they should be, on course for Merseburg. But the formation was nowhere in sight. Holloway faced another decision. Continue to the target alone and attempt to bomb, or turn back toward England. Bombing alone meant flying straight and level through the flak, the most dangerous moment of any mission, when evasive action was impossible and gunners on the ground had time to find their range. But they had flown all this way. They carried 3 tons of bombs meant for a target that was now visible ahead. Before he could decide, Goldstein's voice crackled over the intercom. "Lieutenant, I'm getting traffic on the emergency frequency. Multiple aircraft declaring Mayday. It sounds bad." Holloway told Goldstein to monitor the frequency but maintain radio silence themselves. For the next 4 minutes, they listened to fragments of desperate transmissions. Bombers under heavy fighter attack. Aircraft going down. Crews bailing out. The transmissions were faint, broken up by distance and static, but the message was clear. Somewhere, American bombers were dying in large numbers. At 11:36 a.m. they saw the smoke. 20 miles to their north, where the formation should have been, black smoke trails climbed into the sky. Not just 1 or 2 but dozens. The dark columns marked where bombers were falling from the sky, where men were dying in flames, where aluminum and steel and human dreams were being converted into smoke and wreckage and memory. Mitchell plotted the position. The smoke was rising from exactly where the 100th Bomb Group would have been at this moment if they had continued on their altered heading. The heading they should have been on. The heading the malfunctioning compass had prevented them from following. Foster's voice on the intercom was quiet. "That's our group." The realization spread through the crew like ice water. The formation they had separated from, the bombers they should have been flying with, were under devastating attack. And Lucky 13, alone and vulnerable, the aircraft every tactical manual said was a guaranteed loss, had somehow avoided the ambush completely. Holloway made another decision. He turned Lucky 13 north toward the smoke, toward whatever hell was happening up there. They couldn't bomb Merseburg alone, but they might be able to help. A lone bomber was a target, but a lone bomber could also be a distraction, could pull some fighters away from the main engagement. As they approached the battle they could see it clearly. The sky was full of German fighters, at least 40 of them, maybe more. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s swarmed through the bomber formation like wolves through a flock of sheep. The bombers were scattered, formation discipline broken, each B-17 fighting for its life. 3 bombers were spiraling down even as they watched. Parachutes blossomed in the sky, white flowers marking where men had abandoned their aircraft. Tracer fire crisscrossed the air. The radio was chaos now, all radio discipline abandoned in the desperation of survival. A Focke-Wulf 190 spotted Lucky 13 and broke away from the main attack, climbing toward them. O'Brien called it out from the ball turret, "Fighters 6 o'clock low, climbing fast." Santos and Tucker in the waist positions opened fire. Their tracers reached out toward the approaching fighter, which rolled away from their fire and came around for another pass. Yamamoto in the tail turret had the clearest shot. He led the target perfectly, his bullets walking across the sky toward the fighter. The FW-190 broke off its attack run and dove away. Whether Yamamoto had hit him or whether the German pilot decided a lone bomber wasn't worth the risk against such accurate fire, they never knew. The fighter disappeared into the clouds below them. For the next 18 minutes, Lucky 13 orbited the edge of the battle. They were close enough to see what was happening but far enough to avoid being drawn into the main fighting. Holloway knew they couldn't help. A single bomber couldn't change the outcome. But leaving felt like abandonment, like running away while their friends died. The German fighters finally withdrew at 11:54 a.m., their ammunition exhausted, their fuel running low. The survivors of the 100th Bomb Group, those who could still fly, struggled to reform some semblance of a formation. Holloway counted them. 17 B-17s were still airborne. The formation had launched with 36. 19 bombers had gone down in 20 minutes. Lucky 13 slipped into the formation, taking a position in the shattered high squadron. No one challenged their presence. No one asked where they had been. The survivors were too busy attending to damage, to wounded crew members, to engines that were running rough, to hydraulic systems that were leaking fluid. They turned for home. The damaged formation limped westward across Germany, no longer capable of bombing any target, barely capable of staying in the air. The trip back was a nightmare of nursing damaged aircraft through hostile skies. 2 more bombers fell away, unable to maintain altitude, gliding down to forced landings or crashes in occupied territory. At 2:47 p.m., Lucky 13 crossed the English coast. The clouds had lifted, and they could see the green countryside below, peaceful and untouched by war. Holloway set up his approach to Thorpe Abbotts. His crew was silent now, exhausted and numb. They had survived when they should have died. They had avoided an ambush through sheer accident, through a malfunctioning compass that had driven them off course at exactly the right moment. The landing was routine. Wheels touched down on the runway at 3:02 p.m. Holloway taxied to their revetment and shut down the engines. The sudden silence after 8 hours of engine noise was overwhelming. For a long moment no one moved. They sat in their positions, coming to terms with the fact that they were alive. The debriefing was chaos. The intelligence officers couldn't make sense of what had happened. How had Lucky 13 avoided the ambush? How had they ended up alone while the rest of the formation flew into a carefully planned trap? Holloway explained about the malfunctioning compass, about the formation drifting off course, about his decision to maintain what he believed was the correct heading even when it meant separating from the group. The intelligence officer made notes but didn't comment. The story didn't make sense yet. It would take days of analysis to understand what had actually happened. The details emerged slowly over the next week. German intelligence had intercepted American radio traffic and learned about the raid on Merseburg. They had positioned a massive fighter force along the expected route, waiting to ambush the bomber stream. The ambush had been planned with precision, designed to catch the bombers at their most vulnerable moment. The 100th Bomb Group, following their altered course after the lead navigator was killed, had flown directly into the ambush zone. The German fighters had been positioned perfectly, with altitude advantage and tactical surprise. The attack had been devastating by design. Lucky 13, separated from the formation by their malfunctioning compass, had flown through empty sky while their squadron mates were being slaughtered 20 miles to the north. The compass that should have killed them had saved them. The malfunction that every manual said would lead to disaster had been their salvation. The irony was almost too bitter to comprehend. In trying to stay on the correct course, in following their instruments instead of the formation, they had violated every rule about combat survival. A lone bomber never survives. Formation discipline is everything. Stay with the group. Those were the laws of aerial combat, written in the blood of thousands of airmen. But those laws had failed on November 2, 1944. The safe choice, following the formation, had led to massacre. The suicidal choice, flying alone, had led to survival. And the tool of their salvation had been a broken compass, drifting and uncertain, showing readings that should have led them hopelessly astray. Foster examined the compass after they landed. The problem was subtle, a contamination of the compass fluid that made the card unstable. In normal circumstances, the drift was barely noticeable. But when used to reset a gyro compass that had drifted off course, the malfunctioning compass would have steered them further off track instead of correcting their heading. It was this compounding of errors that had separated them from the formation at exactly the moment when separation meant survival. The ground crew wanted to repair the compass immediately. Foster told them to leave it alone. Some of the crew were superstitious enough to believe that Lucky 13's broken compass was actually lucky, that fixing it would break whatever invisible protection had saved them. It was irrational, of course. But rationality was in short supply among men who had survived when logic said they should have died. The 100th Bomb Group stood down for 3 days after the mission. The personnel losses were catastrophic. 190 men had taken off that morning. 68 were dead or missing. 34 were wounded. The group had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit and would require weeks to rebuild with replacement crews and aircraft. At the memorial service for the lost crews, Holloway sat in the back of the chapel and tried to reconcile what had happened. He had made the right decision based on the information available. His crew had followed procedures. They had used their instruments correctly. And because of that, because of doing everything right, they were alive while 19 other crews were gone. But what haunted him was the knowledge that if their compass had been working properly, they would have died with the others. Competence would have killed them. Following their instruments, trusting their training, maintaining proper navigation, all of it would have led them into the ambush. The only reason they survived was because their equipment had failed. There was no honor in it, no skill, no heroism. Just a malfunction at precisely the right moment to save them from a fate they couldn't have known was waiting. Chen struggled with it differently. He had been the one who noticed the compass malfunction back in England. He had recommended flying the mission anyway, using the directional gyro as primary. If he had insisted on changing aircraft, on getting a bomber with working instruments, the crew would have died. His acceptance of imperfect equipment had saved them. But he couldn't tell if that made him wise or just lucky. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow stolen life from the crews who died, as if survival were a finite resource and his living meant their dying. Mitchell, the navigator, had the hardest time. His entire purpose was to know where they were, to guide the aircraft to the target and back home. He had done his job perfectly. His calculations had been flawless. His navigation had been textbook. And if Holloway had listened to the formation instead of trusting Mitchell's navigation, they would all be dead. The survivors carried this knowledge like a stone. They flew 11 more missions together, completed their tours and went home to America. But the memory of November 2, 1944 went with them. The memory of 19 bombers falling from the sky while they flew through empty air 20 miles away. The memory of doing everything wrong and surviving because of it. Years later, after the war, Holloway would sometimes take out the small brass compass Chen had carried on every mission. He would watch the needle swing to magnetic north, steady and true, and remember the malfunctioning compass that had saved his life. He kept that compass as a reminder of a truth that war had taught him. Sometimes the tools we trust betray us. Sometimes the things that should protect us lead us into danger. And sometimes, the breaking of what should work is the only thing that saves us from catastrophe we cannot see coming. Foster went back to Detroit and rebuilt carburetors in a garage on Michigan Avenue. He never fully trusted instruments again. When customers brought in cars with strange running problems, he would sometimes find that the issue wasn't mechanical at all but rather some quirk of design that created an unexpected benefit. A vacuum leak that actually improved fuel mixture under certain conditions. A timing that was off specification but ran smoother because of it. He would fix these things because that was his job, but always with a moment of hesitation, remembering a compass that saved 10 lives by not working properly. The other crew members scattered across America after the war. Santos opened a restaurant in Santa Fe. Tucker became a teacher in Ohio. O'Brien drove a truck in Boston. Yamamoto returned to California and took over his family's farm. Stevens went to law school. Goldstein worked in electronics. Mitchell became an accountant. They stayed in touch through annual reunions, getting together at various locations around the country. They would drink beer and tell stories and carefully avoid talking about November 2, 1944. Not because they had forgotten but because remembering hurt too much. The question that haunted them was simple and unanswerable. Why us? Why had their compass malfunctioned when hundreds of other compasses worked perfectly? Why had the formation drifted off course at the exact moment that put them into an ambush? Why had Lucky 13 been separated by chance when separation normally meant death? Why had the German fighters ignored them when they were the most vulnerable target in the sky? There were no answers. Just coincidence piled upon coincidence, creating survival from circumstances that should have guaranteed death. The compass shouldn't have malfunctioned. The formation shouldn't have drifted. The ambush shouldn't have been positioned exactly where the error would lead them. Lucky 13 shouldn't have been spared when alone. But all of those impossible things had happened. A chain of improbabilities that added up to life instead of death. And the crew of Lucky 13 had to live with the knowledge that they survived not because they were better pilots or braver men or more deserving of life, but because a compass failed at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way. In 1962, Chen tracked down the aircraft maintenance records from November 1, 1944, the day before the mission. The entry for Lucky 13 noted that ground crew had serviced all instruments, including compasses, and signed off that all systems were functioning within normal parameters. The malfunction that would develop overnight wasn't visible during the pre-flight inspection. Chen spent years trying to understand the physics of how compass fluid could become contaminated in a way that would cause drift but not be detectable during static testing. He consulted with engineers and read technical manuals and eventually concluded that the specific failure mode that had affected their compass was probably unique. The exact combination of factors, the type of contamination, the temperature conditions, the magnetic environment of that particular aircraft in that particular location, might never occur again in exactly the same way. Which meant that their survival was even more improbable than they had thought. Not just unlikely but singular. A perfect storm of mechanical failure that happened to create salvation instead of disaster. The compass from Lucky 13 ended up in Foster's garage in Detroit. After the war, he had requested it from the Air Force, calling in favors and writing letters until the bureaucracy eventually released it to him. It sat on a shelf above his workbench, a brass instrument in a wooden box, still showing the slight drift that had once saved 10 lives. Occasionally, customers would ask about it. Foster would tell them it was a broken compass from the war. Most didn't ask for details. Those who did would hear a carefully edited version of the story: a navigation problem on a mission, a close call, survival through luck. He never mentioned the 19 bombers that went down. Never talked about the men who died following their working instruments while he lived because his instruments failed. Some truths are too heavy to share with strangers. In November 1994, 50 years after the mission, the surviving crew members of Lucky 13 gathered at Thorpe Abbotts, which had been converted into a museum dedicated to the 100th Bomb Group. 6 of them were still alive: Holloway, Chen, Foster, Santos, O'Brien, and Mitchell. The others had died over the years from age and accident and illness. But November 2, 1944 hadn't killed any of them. They walked out to where their revetment had been, where Lucky 13 had sat that morning in the gray English dawn. The concrete was crumbling now, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. A small plaque marked the spot, listing all the aircraft and crews that had flown from this field. Foster brought the compass. They passed it around, each man holding it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The fluid inside was cloudy now, the card frozen in place. It didn't work at all anymore, hadn't worked for decades. But for one day in November 1944, it had worked better than any instrument should, guiding them away from death by pointing in the wrong direction. They talked about the men who hadn't come back. 19 crews, 190 names on the memorial wall in the museum. Friends and squadron mates and strangers united only by the fact that they had followed their instruments correctly and died because of it. There was no making sense of it. No lesson to extract. No moral to the story. Just the bare fact of survival and loss, of chance and consequence, of the arbitrary nature of who lives and who dies when machines fail and men make guesses, and war creates situations where every choice leads to death except one, and nobody can predict which one it will be. As the sun set over the English countryside, painting the sky in colors that reminded them of tracer fire and burning bombers, the 6 survivors stood in silence. They were old men now, grandfathers, retired from jobs and lives that the war had made possible because they had lived through it. Finally Chen spoke. "We didn't deserve to survive more than they did." Nobody argued. It was the truth they had all lived with for 50 years. "But we did survive," Holloway added. "And we have to decide what that means." They never reached a conclusion. Perhaps there was no conclusion to reach. Survival is not justice. Survival is not reward. Survival is simply the state of continuing to exist when existence was threatened. No moral weight attaches to it. No meaning except the meaning the survivors choose to create. The 6 men walked back to their cars as darkness fell over Thorpe Abbotts. They would meet one more time 5 years later, when O'Brien died and they gathered for his funeral. Then the reunions would stop, the survivors too old or too sick or too scattered to continue the tradition. But the memory would persist. The memory of a morning when a broken compass saved 10 lives by pointing them away from disaster they could not see. The memory of 19 bombers falling from the sky while they flew through empty air, spared by malfunction and chance. The memory of survival earned through nothing but the random failure of an instrument that should have worked. In the museum at Thorpe Abbotts, there is a display case containing various artifacts from the 100th Bomb Group service in World War II. Uniforms and medals, photographs and letters, pieces of aircraft recovered from crash sites across Europe. In one corner of the case sits a brass compass in a wooden box. The placard beside it tells the story simply. Magnetic compass from B-1742 to 31,673, Lucky 13. Malfunctioned on November 2, 1944. Malfunction led to aircraft separating from formation and inadvertently avoiding German fighter ambush. Entire crew survived. Compass never repaired. Visitors sometimes pause at this display trying to understand how a broken instrument could save lives. The explanation is there in the historical records, in the mission reports and intelligence analyses. But the deeper truth, the truth about randomness and survival and the terrible mathematics of war, that truth resists explanation. 10 men lived because an instrument failed. 190 men died because their instruments worked. The compass that should have led to disaster became the instrument of salvation. The tools that should have provided safety led to catastrophe. Sometimes the world works that way. Sometimes the breaking of what should work is the only thing that saves us. And sometimes we survive not because we are skilled or brave or deserving, but simply because chance and circumstance align in ways that cannot be predicted or replicated or understood. The crew of Lucky 13 learned this lesson at 24,000 feet over Germany on a November morning in 1944. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives, this knowledge that survival can be arbitrary, that safety can be illusion, and that the instruments we trust can lead us into danger while the instruments that fail might point toward life. The broken compass sits in its case in England, pointing nowhere now, its fluid clouded and its mechanism frozen. But for one day in one aircraft over one piece of European sky, It pointed away from death with a precision that no working instrument could match. That is its legacy. That is the story it tells. Not a story of triumph or heroism or skill, but a story of chance and survival and the terrible, wonderful randomness of which lives continue and which lives end when men fly through sky where other men are trying to kill them. The compass is silent now. But its message echoes across the decades to anyone who takes time to listen. Sometimes the breaking of what should work is the only thing that saves us from the catastrophe we cannot see coming. And sometimes that has to be enough.